Does the words Chasal Siddur Pesach mean anything to anybody?
Yeah.
What is it?
The end of Pesach.
The end of Pesach Seder.
Yeah.
Yeah, what?
Maxwell House.
Maxwell House. Bill, no?
Means nothing.
No, you ever heard of that phrase before?
I guess not.
Sounds like it's a siddur for Pesach.
This concludes this.
Avram, you've said this before?
This is years ago.
Years ago. Okay, so Chasal Siddur Pesach, if you open up any Haggadah, other than a Chabad Haggadah, you will see that at the end of the Seder, there is the end Shon Habab Yishalayim, and then it says Chasal Siddur Pesach Kilchasa. It's a 2-line poem, which is basically we've completed the Seder and we've done all the details right, and we should be zeicher to do it with Mashiach and etc. Now in Chabad we don't say this, and the Rebbe explained that it's actually specific that the Alter Rebbe did not include this in his Siddur, because we don't want to sort of say we've concluded the Seder. We want to continue the Seder onto the rest of the year. Let's see if I can quickly find the quote the way the Rebbe says this. Anyway. So anyway, here it goes. Der Rebbe Rabbeinu Hazokin, the Alter Rebbe, hat nicht reingestellt in Siddur nach der Haggadah die Wörter Chasal zu der Pesach. He didn't include in the Siddur the words Chasal zu der Pesach. Weil bei Chabad endigt sich nicht der Pesach, nur es wird nicht ständig, because in Chabad Pesach doesn't end. Rather, its I guess its effect or its celebration, whatever, is continued constantly. The truth is that every Yom Tov has a certain hashpah, a certain impact that affects the rest of the year. Maybe you could say Purim is Simcha for the whole year, and Shavuos is Torah, etc., etc. Nor Chag HaPesach wird nimshach ständig. But this idea that the relevance of the Yom Tov continues constantly, which is true of all the Yom Tovim, is even more true and more extenuated, is that the word, on Pesach. Now the truth is that just the fact that the Alter Rebbe didn't include it in the Siddur is not proof that we shouldn't say it, because there's many things that the Alter Rebbe, in fact, even all the other songs, Machad Gadya and Echad Miyodeya and all these other songs which are traditionally sung in the Seder and Chabad don't sing them, just the fact that they're not in the Siddur is not reason in and of itself not to sing it, because these are just songs that you sing. They don't have to be in the Siddur. The Alter Rebbe is putting in the Siddur those things which there's a specific nusach which you have to follow. But the custom in Chabad did develop over time not to sing these songs, and it's not that's actually not the topic of today's class. But the point is, practically speaking, the Rebbe is saying that we do not say it, and the Rebbe does seem to be attributing it that somehow it's significant that the Alter Rebbe didn't include this in the Siddur. It is different than the other songs. Chasal Siddur Pesach is considered sort of more part of the text of the Seder than Chad Gadya and the other songs. Now, in my mind, growing up with, we were always taught this in school, we don't say Chasal Siddur Pesach because we bring Pesach to the whole year. So I always had this impression that, Chasal Siddur Pesach is something that somebody who, somebody wrote who didn't understand the beauty and the relevance of Pesach to the whole, But actually that's not the case at all. There is a piyut, a poem, written by a very early Rishon in France by the name of Rabbi Yosef Tov Elam, or Tov Elam. And he is an early Rishon. He lived I believe in the 11th century, give or take, so basically over 1,000 years ago. And he wrote a poem. And the poem is actually designed to be said on Shabbos HaGadol, on the Shabbos before Pesach, during Shachris. Now here you have another time where in Chabad, and I don't know exactly if this was always the case in Chabad or it developed later, it's not the time for that discussion right now, but in Chabad we basically never say piyutim, we never say the extra poems in davening with the exception of, when do we say piyutim? Okay.
And Rosh Hashanah
Very good.
and Yom Kippur.
Very good. We say very, very short ones on the Shabbos of Geshem, on Geshem and Tal, on Shmini Atzeres and Pesach. And Geshem and Tal, we say very short piyutim at the beginning of Chazoros Hashatz. But in other communities, they say a lot more. And once upon a time, they said many, many, many more poems. We've spoken about this in the past. And even today, even those who do say it, say a lot less than they used to. In Chabad, it's almost non-existent. But there is the special piyutim that are said on Shabbos HaGadol, which is the Shabbos before Pesach, and if you open up any non-Chabad Siddur, which I have here in my hand, the art scroll, this is a Ashkenaz Siddur, you go to the back, there's what's called the Yotzer LeShabbos HaGadol.
When do you say that?
So this is said during the repetition of the Amidah for Shachris on the Shabbos before Pesach. And there's a part for the first bracha, the second bracha, and then there's a long piyut, which starts with the word. This piyut is known as Elikei Haruchis L'chol Basar. People refer to this piyut as Elikei Haruchis. Those are the first two words. Elikei Haruchis L'chol Basar Chayk La'ami Masar, that God, who knows the spirits of all livings, has given us laws, and He commanded us to keep the laws. And then He goes on fairly long. I'll show you here in the Art Scroll Siddur. It's fairly small font, and it's 1, 2, 3 full pages, right? And it's a poem, quite terse language, very poetic. It doesn't spell everything out so clearly, and it goes through all the laws with quite some detail, starting from the mitzvah of checking for chametz on the night of b'dikas chametz, all the way through the night of Erev Pesach and Erev Pesach and the day of Erev Pesach and the mitzvah of Dalat Kosos and all the mitzvahs of the Seder. And then when he finishes the whole long poem, he says, okay, Chasal Siddur Pesach Kil Chosei, I finished telling you all that you need to know about Pesach. And he finishes off his poem, we should be Zeichen to Mashiach to do the Korban Pesach in real, etc. So that's the source of this line, and this line was imported into the end of the Haggadah. And then, in the context of Shabbos HaGadol, v'chein l'chosal l'kedusha ki'ato kadosh Yisrael l'Mashiach nakdishach v'na'aritzach, or in the Kaddish Hashem Chava'ilim, right? That leads into kedusha. Okay. Now, this poem, despite it being a poem, and despite it being designed to say as part of davening, and despite it being very terse language, which lends itself, or many of the lines might lend themselves to numerous levels of interpretation, is taken very, very seriously by scholars already in the Balei HaTosos, and we deduce halacha from here. You know, in Yosef Tevelim writes in his poem which seems to imply the halacha is such and such and such. And even though it doesn't say this halacha anywhere else, but Rabbi Yosef Tevelim himself is, and we don't say he was just doing it because it fit nicely in the poem. No, we take him very seriously, and many commentaries have been written to this poem, and we really take this halacha seriously. And there's many halachas and minhagim on Pesach that their original source is from this poem. Okay, everything I've said until now, put on the side, we're going to come back to it soon. When it comes to the laws of Pesach, and specifically the laws of the Seder, so in Chabad, I would say there are 3 very important texts that we take into account, which basically serve as the basis for almost everything that we do or don't do on the night of the Seder. Number 1 is the Shulchan Aruch, and specifically the Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch. The Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch is a halachic sort of anthology taking from all the previous poskim, and he summarizes all the laws and explains the basis for all the different laws, and if there are numerous opinions, he'll explain the basis for the different opinions, and he'll adjudicate, okay, in this case we follow this opinion, here we follow that opinion, here, if you're necessary, you can rely on that opinion, but ideally you should be more strict and do it in such a way, etc., etc. Then, the Alter Rebbe wrote a Siddur. The Siddur of the Alter Rebbe included the text of the davening, the way the Alter Rebbe chose to, from all the different minhagim, etc., it shows what the best way to do the text of the davening is, which is the nusach, what we call today the Tehillas Hashem, the quote Chabad Siddur. That's the text of the Alter Rebbe Siddur of the davening, and the Alter Rebbe Siddur also includes halachic guidelines in all sorts of areas. In other words, it's not a full-fledged Shulchan Aruch with many details, but it's just sort of telling you what to do. Things that you need to know about tzitzis, about tefillin, about Shabbos, about etc. And of course, there's a Haggadah printed in there, right? In the Alter Rebbe Siddur, there's a Haggadah which includes the texts of everything you say on the Seder night, and also instructions for the Seder night. And then there is the Rebbe published at the behest of his father-in-law in the 1940s, published his commentary on the Alter Rebbe's Haggadah, and the Rebbe's Haggadah, the Rebbe's commentary to Haggadah, is a booklet that has merited tremendous amount of discussion and study over the years, and pointing to a tremendous work. And in that commentary, the Rebbe often interprets or explains things that the Alter Rebbe is saying, or things that the Alter Rebbe might be alluding to, or the Rebbe often brings in tradition from later Chabad Rabbeim of things that we do at the Seder, etc. So basically, if you want to know how to do Chabad Seder with all the details, you're going to learn those approximately 10 chapters of Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch that pertain to the night of the Seder, and you would read the Alter Rebbe's the Haggadah section of the Alter Rebbe Siddur, and you read the Rebbe's commentary on the Haggadah, and then you pretty much got it covered. Now, before we go into Pesach, let's take a step back a second and look at these two works, the Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch and the Alter Rebbe Siddur. The Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch is Paskin Halacha, how do you day-to-day life from the beginning of the morning all through the day and Hilchos Shabbos. And then there's the Siddur. The Siddur, again, was not written as a code. The Siddur was written that people should know how to pray. But in the Siddur, the Alter Rebbe also included many things of how to do things. Now, the fact is that in the Siddur, there are many things that the Alter Rebbe writes differently than he wrote in the Shulchan Aruch. So, which one do we follow? Do we follow the Siddur, or do we follow the Shulchan Aruch?
Mostly the Siddur.
For the most part, we follow the Siddur. Why? Because the Alter Rebbe wrote the Siddur much later on in his life, and so the assumption is that, for whatever reason, he changed his mind. If he writes something different, it means he changed his mind from what he earlier said, so we follow the later ruling. That's perfectly in line with traditional Torah scholarship. People study more, they develop new ideas, etc., and they change their mind on certain rulings. So let's just give a number of examples of things that we do today that follow the Siddur, that are counter to what the Alter Rebbe says in Shulchan Aruch. So one example comes to mind is when we put on tefillin, we make a bracha on the hand tefillin. Do we make a bracha on the head tefillin?
No.
We do not. Unless you spoke or interrupted in the middle, right? If you open Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch, it's clear that you say two brachas, one bracha on the hand tefillin, one bracha on the head tefillin. And in fact, that is quite common minhag. Most probably, Bill, that's what you do, right? Do you make a bracha on your head tefillin?
Yeah, I think that's what we do.
Right? So Bill makes a bracha on his head tefillin. And do you say
That's
Baruch
what
Shem
Bill-
afterwards?
No.
You would, if you knew, you would, right? Okay, but if you would know. That's what I meant. The point is that the Alter Rebbe in the Shulchan Aruch also says to make two brachas on one on the hand tefillin, one on the head tefillin. But in the Siddur, the Alter Rebbe says clearly, no, we do not make. You only make a bracha on the hand tefillin, right? Okay, there's many examples like that. Another perhaps famous example is, what do you do if a fly lands in your cup on Shabbos, right? So in Shulchan Aruch, the Alter Rebbe says that what you do is, because you're not allowed to separate on Shabbos, so you can't just pull out the fly from your cup of coffee or bowl of soup. So in the Siddur, the Alter Rebbe says what you should do is take a spoon and pick up the bug, and together with the bug take some soup as well, so you haven't separated the bug from the soup, and just throw the whole thing out. In the Siddur, the Alter Rebbe says, no, don't do that. That could be really bad. Rather, you should just pour the cup and spill out coffee or spill out soup until the bug goes out together with it. Now we're not going to get into that whole discussion, but that's just another famous example of a difference that the Alter Rebbe paskins between the Siddur and the Shulchan Aruch. Now, the first person to start sort of really bringing this to light, that there are differences between the Shulchan Aruch and the Siddur. I mean, there was like everybody, how do you do whatever? How do you put on tefillin? You put on tefillin how your father taught you to put on tefillin, right? So people just knew what to do. So Chabad Chassidim always followed the Siddur, but sort of the first person to write about this extensively is Rebbe Avram David Lavut, who was the Rebbe's grandfather, who wrote a sefer called Shar HaKoilel, where he delves in a lot of topics in the Alter Rebbe Siddur, both in the halachas of the Alter Rebbe Siddur and also on the text, on the nusach of the Siddur, and explains the basis for many, many things. So he already draws a lot of attention to the differences. The Alter Rebbe is writing in the Siddur such and such, which differs from what he wrote earlier in the Shulchan Aruch. And then there was the next person who really took it to a whole new level was Rabbi Avram Chaim Noah. Avram Chaim Noah was a Chabad Rav who lived in Yerushalayim, and he was there already, I believe, in the 1920s. And in fact, at the very end of this article of his, which I have printed out over here, which is, it's later. This is signed in 1937. He's talking about the terrible difficulties that are in Israel, financially and safety, and not safety, safety in the streets, and the fact that we no longer have access to the Kaisal. So I don't know exactly when that occurred. That the 1937, it seems already the Jews were no longer able to access the Kaisel. Well, I don't know if that changed. It didn't change, but it was a difficult time. So he was already there in Yerushalayim. He was a very, very prominent Chabad Rav, and many Chabad today. I'll put it this way: not every issue that you say we follow Reb Chaim Noah, but if an issue comes up and you say, "Oh yeah, Reb Chaim Noah says this is fine," that carries weight, right? You could rely on Reb Chaim Noah. You might. Chaim Noah is a very prominent authority in Chabad, and he wrote a number of stories. He wrote a sefer called Shulchan, which is kind of like a summary of Shulchan Aruch based on the Alter Rebbe, on which he has notes called Badei HaShulchan, where fascinating notes often. And then, amongst his other Sfarim, there's a sefer called Piskei HaSiddur, which Piskei HaSiddur purports to make a comprehensive list of every single item which the Alter Rebbe writes in the Siddur differently than what he wrote in the Shulchan Aruch. I'm going to take a whole list, and it's a 50-page booklet, and he goes through every single item that the Alter Rebbe does differently than he does in the Siddur. Now, I don't think there's any debate around who do we follow. It seems to be clear that if there's a difference between the Shulchan Aruch and the Siddur, we follow, certainly as Chassidim of the Alter Rebbe, we follow the Siddur. But there are two questions which take a lot of attention of scholars. Number one, why did the Alter Rebbe change his mind? What changed? Right? And number two is how to determine if there is in fact a change. And what that means is, the Shulchan Aruch is written, most of the chapters of the Shulchan Aruch are written as a comprehensive code. In other words, I'm telling you all the opinions, I'm telling you, there may be more in the fridge, I'm telling you all the opinions, I'm telling you all the basis for all the different opinions, I'm explaining to you how we got from how we got here, and this is why we got here. The Siddur is not written in that language. The Siddur is just written, I'm telling you what to do. Turn to page 37 and rise and say this part, right? It's just telling you what to do. So often there may be you might see this, read the Shulchan Aruch, read the Siddur, and you say, oh, there's an omission over here. Or you might say, sorry?
Why didn't they just update the Shulchan Aruch with his findings in the Siddur, which is newer?
Well, that's a very good question. To fully address it is way beyond the scope of today, but I think what I'm saying now partially answers that question. they're two different books. The Shulchan Aruch is written as a code. The Siddur is written as a book which has some instructions of what to do. So the question is, when you find an omission of a detail, for example, in the Siddur, is that actually to be understood as an omission because the Alter Rebbe changed his mind over here, or was it omitted from the Siddur because we don't need to get into all the details in the Siddur? And here, I'll give you one example that comes to mind. After you eat fruit from the Shiva Samin, there's the 7 species of fruit which Eretz Yisrael is praised with. 2 of them are wheat and barley, which are not really fruit, so let's skip them out of this equation for the moment. The other 5 are... David Yehuda, what are the other 5 species?
Like figs.
Figs, very good.
Like grapes and stuff.
Grapes, not grapes and stuff, just grapes.
Like oranges and stuff.
No,
No?
no. Figs, grapes, anyone else? Dates?
Oh, dates.
Dates?
Pomegranate.
Pomegranates?
Pomegranates.
And olives.
Ah.
Okay? Figs, dates, pomegranates, grapes, and olives. If you eat a kezayis of those fruits, what is the after bracha?
Whatever it says in the book.
You have to have the kazayas?
Huh?
You have to have the kazayas to...
Yeah, you never say an after bracha unless in the kezayis.
No, Shulchan said, as long as you have the whole mitzias, you have
No,
to-
that's you're probably misremembering what Rabbi Shusman said. Rabbi Shusman said was that you shouldn't eat a whole grape or a whole pomegranate seed because then you have a suffix whether you need to have a bracha achrona and therefore you have to eat a kazais. That's already it's in the Rishonim already. Alter Rebbe brings that if you eat a whole date, it's going to be bigger than an olive. If you eat a whole fig, it's bigger than an olive. If you eat a whole olive, it's the size of an olive. But if you eat a whole grape and a whole pomegranate seed, which are smaller than an olive, so then that's a shaila. Do you not make a bracha achrona because it's less than an olive, or do you make a bracha achrona because it's a complete natural item? Rabbi Yosef, I want to make a special mention of Rabbi Yosef, whose creativity allowed us to have locks this morning. L'chaim, l'chaim. Okay, thank you.
Worked out completely.
And there's none left, so hopefully there's a bit left. But all right, you could come and get some. So you should never eat one grape. You should either eat half a grape or 2 grapes or 3 grapes, and then you could say a bracha achrona. Depends on the size of an olive, which we're not going to talk about now. Okay, so there's an after bracha. We don't just say the regular short paragraph of Borei Nefashos. We say what's called the bracha achas me'ein shalish of al ha'etz v'al pri ha'etz v'al tenuvas hasada v'al eretz chemda, etc. The bracha that we usually colloquially refer to as al hamichya is actually al hamichya is when you have grains, so cookies and anything that's not bread, cookies, cake, etc., pasta. But al ha'etz v'al pri ha'etz is for fruit. Now, at the end of that bracha finishes off Baruch Atah Hashem al ha'aretz v'al ha'peiros. We thank Hashem for the land and for the fruit. Now in Shulchan Aruch it says that if you ate fruit, and by the way this applies to wine as well. After you have wine, the bracha. What's the after bracha for wine? Al ha'gefen v'al pri ha'gefen. Also the same, right? So again we finish off al ha'aretz v'al pri ha'gefen. In the Shulchan Aruch it says that if you're having fruit or wine that comes from Eretz Yisrael, that's product of Israel, so then you don't say al ha'aretz v'al pri ha'gefen or al ha'aretz v'al ha'peiros. Rather you say al ha'aretz v'al pri gafna and al ha'aretz v'al peiroseha. Not thanking Hashem for the land and for wine or for the land and for fruit, but rather for the land and for its wine and the land and its fruit. Right? So for example, this is quite common. You have wine from Israel. You make havdalah. If you're a kiddush, you bench anyway. You don't say it. But if you make havdalah and wine from Israel, the bracha achrona is different. Now, in the that's what the Alter Rebbe says in Shulchan Aruch. In the Siddur, the Alter Rebbe omits this difference between produce of Israel and produce of other countries. And so Reb Chaim Noah, in his book Piskei HaSiddur, he deduces from here that the Alter Rebbe doesn't hold of it, that even if it's from Israel, you just stick to the regular text. But the Rebbe disagreed with him, and in a letter from the Rebbe says, no. The Alter Rebbe didn't put in this detail because the Alter Rebbe is writing a Siddur with instructions for people who live in Russia, 250 years ago. They never saw wine from Israel. So if I'm telling you all the halachas of this bracha, I'm going to tell you all the halachas, even those halachas which you're never going to encounter right now in Russia. But if I'm giving you a Siddur with your instruction manual of what to do, just like the Siddur that we use here today doesn't tell you what to do if you live in Israel when it's only one day Yom Tov, for example, because this is a Siddur published for Americans, right? So the Siddur published for Russians doesn't tell you, for Russians 250 years ago, doesn't tell you how to change the text of the bracha if you're drinking wine or eating fruit that is the produce of Israel, because that was irrelevant to people living in Russia back in the day, right? So here you just see an example of an omission which one scholar, Reb Chaim Noah, understood to be a retraction, that even though in Shulchan Aruch it says we differentiate between whether it's produce from Israel or not, in the Siddur the Alter Rebbe is, quote, changing his mind, and the Rebbe comes along and says, no, don't read this as an omission, just read as an omission, well, it's an omission, but don't see this as a retraction, rather see it as an omission because it wasn't relevant. I'll send you the recording.
How's his last name spelled?
Nun Aleph Hey. In English, they spell it Naeh. So, again, let's summarize where we're up to. We have the Shulchan Aruch, we have the Siddur, we have differences between the two, and there are two questions that we often have to address. Number one, why is there a change? Because often understanding the reason for the change could impact our attitude to different things. And secondly, in many cases, we have to question, is this actually a change, or is just an omission or a different of style, because it's not in the style of a code, it's in the style of a Siddur. Yes?
Got it.
Got it. Okay.
However, why today haven't they updated the Siddur then for like that bracha for things over Israel, from wine over Israel?
You see? Do you want to pass the Siddur off the shelf, which has the actual...
Let me check this one.
All right, Rebbe is asking a very good question. Why is this difference between a bracha achrona and produce of Israel not alluded to at all in the annotated Siddur? Now, why it's not in the text of the bracha, because whatever, maybe they don't want to make changes, I'm not sure, but it doesn't even seem to appear in the selected laws and customs in the back of the Siddur. So I believe this may warrant an email to Kahas. I don't know. I wonder. I don't know though. I'm a little bit surprised that it's not here. I wonder if it's just an accidental omission or they have a reason not to put it here. Anyway, moving on. So the Shah HaKoilel, who, as mentioned before, that's Rabbi Avraham Chaim David Levut, the Rebbe's grandfather, he writes that the reason for most of the changes between the Siddur and the Shulchan Aruch is because you have the standard track of how to determine halacha, which is you study the Talmud, you study the commentaries on the Talmud. This is called, in vernacular, we would refer to that as the poskim, the halachic authorities, and we have a system of how we filter through all the relevant information and we come up with a ruling. That's, we would say, we're following the poskim. Then there's another system which would be the Mukubalim, the mystics, the Kabbalists, right? Taking Kabbalistic sources into account. So what do we do if there's a conflict? So there is a story that comes down in tradition from Chabad, which the Shah HaKoilel says that he himself heard this from Rav Hillel Paracha. Rav Hillel Paracha was a very prominent Chabad Chassid of a little bit of the Alter Rebbe and the Mittel Rebbe and Tzemach Tzedek. He lived a very long life, and he said he heard this from Chassidim of the Alter Rebbe, who in turn shared it with Rebbe Avraham Chaim with Rabbi Lavut, Rabbi David Lavut, who published it in his Sefer Shara Koilel, in the very first chapter of his Sefer, and he writes like this: that one time they asked Alter Rebbe, how should we conduct ourselves when there is a conflict between what's going on? Everything okay?
Mm-hmm.
How should we conduct ourselves when there is a conflict between the Kabbalists and the Poskim, the Mukabalim and the Poskim? So the Alter Rebbe answered them, most likely you should follow the Kabbalists.
Really?
So they said back to him, hold on a second. You yourself wrote in Shulchan Aruch, in the laws of Tefillin, that if there is a difference between the Poskim and the Mukabalim, you should follow the Poskim. You should follow the halachic authorities. So which one is it? In your Shulchan Aruch you wrote to follow the halachic authorities. Now you're telling us we should follow the Kabbalists. Which one is it? Where does the Alter Rebbe say this in Shulchan Aruch? One second. Some people say that following the Zohar is Kabbalah, right? The Zohar's Kabbalah says that you should put the hand tefillin sitting down and the head tefillin standing up, right? But our minhag is to put them both standing up because the poskim say you should put them both standing up. And then the Alter Rebbe continues that any time you have a machlokes between the Kabbalists and the Zohar versus the Gemara and the poskim, you should follow the poskim, unless if the Mukabalim are more machmir than what it says in the Poskim, then it's okay to be more machmir because the Kabbalists have this chumrah, an extra stringency. Or if it's something which is, as far as the Gemara or the Poskim is concerned, is completely neutral, it's neither here nor there. So then you could follow the Kabbalists. Or another example, which Alter Rebbe doesn't say, is when there's no way to determine it based on the Poskim. Whatever the case is, and that could be actually a very interesting topic for another class. But here we have this conflict where the Alter Rebbe in Shulchan Aruch writes clearly that in case of contradiction between Poskim and Mukabalim, we follow the Poskim. And here they ask them, and they says follow the Mukabalim. And this is, by the way, a good example. Like even till today, you see, for example, in our shul we have Rabbi Yochanan who puts on his hand tefillin sitting down, which is based on this whole discussion. Anyway, so they asked Alter Rebbe, how could you say that we should follow the Mukabalim? You yourself wrote in the Shulchan Aruch that you have to follow the Poskim. So the Alter Rebbe said to them that, of course, in the Shulchan Aruch I'm going to write to follow the Poskim because the Shulchan Aruch is a halachic work, and in halachic work you have to follow halachic norms and halachic formula. And halachic formula is that when there's a conflict between the Poskim and the Mukabalim, I'm going to tell you to follow the Poskim. However, the Mukabalim, the mystically inclined, and the Kabbalists will tell you to follow the Mukabalim. So now if you ask me what to do outside of my Shulchan Aruch, I'm going to tell you to follow the Mukabalim, right? So we have this kind of like, well, which one is it? You have to sort of read in between the lines and I don't know. Which hat am I wearing? If I'm wearing my rabbi hat, I'm going to tell you follow the poskim. If I'm wearing my mukubal hat, I'm going to tell you follow the mukubalim. We're not going to cover this whole topic right now, but what the Shara Koilel is suggesting is that that's really the difference. All these cases where the Alter Rebbe changes his mind from the Shulchan Aruch versus in the Siddur is because in the Shulchan Aruch he's following the poskim, and in the Siddur he's following the mukubalim.
So doesn't it come down to what you're most comfortable with and what you could justify? You know, you could say I'm going to do it sitting down and then standing up, and then I could justify it with this set of text here, and
there may be occasions when that's the case. It's not always going to be the case. There may be occasions when that's the case. The truth is that it's interesting how in fact Minhag Yisrael, not just Chabad, general custom has developed in certain areas, and specifically when it comes to tefillin, there are many things that everybody does when it comes to tefillin that has no basis in the poskim, and it's only the mukabalim. For example, let's talk to a Jew who does not follow Chabad customs, our token Ashkenaz participant, right?
I have to remember.
Right? When you put on tefillin, right? So you strap the tefillin around your hand, you wrap it around your muscles, your forearm, and then what do you do next?
7 wraps.
You wrap it around your arm, and then what do you do next?
Take a shin and then
Well, then I just wrap it
You
around.
wrap it around your hand, and then you put on your head tefillin. Right?
And I do,
So-
I do say.
You do say a bracha, but
no.
no.
Al mitzvah tefillin and then Baruch Shem Kuvah. I do.
Oh, you do say the bar. Okay,
I
fine,
just
good.
remembered that.
All right, but go back a stage. You're telling me that you wrap the 7 things on the 7 coils on your arm before you put on the head tefillin. Now,
Correct.
that's a problem because you're not supposed to interrupt in between putting on the hand tefillin and the head tefillin. And it would be much better, according to the poskim, for you to just put it over here on on the muscle, and then put it on the head tefillin, and then wrap the coils around your arms.
What am I interrupting?
But you're interrupting by putting the 7 coils around your arm before putting on your head tefillin, and you're supposed to put them on adjacent. So why do you do that? Don't worry, you're not doing anything wrong. The reason you do that is because al pi Kabbalah, it's better to do it that way. But here's an example of something which Klal Yisrael as a whole have, and again, beyond the scope of right now to discuss how exactly that developed in this specific instance, but the fact is that there are certain instances where the custom amongst all Jewish communities today is to follow the Kabbalists' way of doing things against the Poskum's way of doing things. So this is one example that we all wrap the 7 coils around our arm before we put on the head tefillin, which is the basis for that is al pi Kabbalah, not al pi halacha. There's many other examples as well. Not for right now. Okay. So that's the Shara Kohel's take. Basically, in the Siddur, we're following the Poskim. In the Shulchan Aruch, in the Shulchan Aruch, we're following the Poskim. In the Siddur, we're following the Kabbalah. Klopus again of Chaim Noah in his introduction. Remember I told you before, Chaim Noah wrote a pamphlet, a kunshus, a booklet, with a comprehensive list of all the changes between the Siddur and the Shulchan Aruch. So in his introduction, he has an introduction to this sefer. He says, okay, let's figure this out. Why do we have all these changes? And he quotes the Shara Kohelel. And he says, actually, this makes no sense. Because if you look at the vast majority of the differences between the Shulchan Aruch and the Siddur, they do not pertain at all to machlokes between the Mukabalim and the Poskim. So it's nice in theory, and we know that in general the Alter Rebbe sort of had this conflict, if you will, of, well, do we follow the Poskim or we follow the Mukabalim? But in fact, if you get into the details, that does not explain the vast majority of the differences. And so he goes on to explain a whole number of things. For example, one of his things is that in the Siddur, the Alter Rebbe was much more concerned about avoiding a possible bracha in vain, and therefore there are many brachas which in Shulchan Aruch the Alter Rebbe would accept to say those brachas, but in the Siddur the Alter Rebbe says better refrain from it because of the severity of saying a bracha in vain. Which, by the way, that's at least in part what shapes the minhag that we only say one bracha on the tefillin in order to avoid saying a bracha levatala. Even your minhag takes that into account, because the reason you say Baruch Shem afterwards is because if you say a bracha in vain, you're supposed to say Baruch Shem Kvod Malchusay Le'olam Va'ed. So the general practice amongst Ashkenazim is that you do say a second bracha, because for the most part we follow the opinion that the head tefillin does warrant its own bracha. But just in case, according to those authorities, that you're not supposed to say a bracha on the head tefillin, so we say Baruch Shem, just to satisfy them. So, but the Alter Rebbe in the Siddur takes it a step further, and he says, no, we're going to make sure we avoid a bracha in vain at all costs, and therefore we don't say a bracha on the head tefillin. Okay. But then he writes a very interesting thing. He writes that Piskei halachos shebesiddur rubam kekulam hem lahachmir yosem mima shepasak b'Shulchan Aruch. Most of the changes between the Siddur and the Shulchan Aruch lean in the Siddur towards a chumrah, to being more stringent than he was in the Shulchan Aruch. She'izein v'tikein ha'alacha lotzis gam das ha'machmirim. He updated the halacha to follow even the opinion of those who are more strict. K'moshe b'mavur b'fneim, as is explained inside in his book, as he's going to elaborate. And only very few places is he more lenient in the Siddur than he is in the Shulchan Aruch. Okay, so basically this principle Rabbi Chaim Noah is setting down over here. that the reason for the change in the vast majority of cases, or in many of the cases, is that the way the halachic system works is you take all the different opinions and interpretations of the Gemara into account, and you filter through them, and you follow the majority, you follow the sort of systems of how to figure out what to do. And that's how the Shulchan Aruch is written. Whereas in the Siddur, the Alter Rebbe is telling us we should be extra strict. And even though, everybody says this, but there's only one opinion that has this unusual interpretation in the Gemara, let's say, but in this case we're going to follow this interpretation. Okay. Now, I want to come back to the Haggadah. And remember, the Haggadah is part of the Alter Rebbe Siddur. So when the Alter Rebbe writes something in the Haggadah, first of all, we have, and it seems on some level an omission or differently than the Alter Rebbe writes in the Shulchan Aruch, we have to ask ourselves these two questions. Number one, is this actually a retraction or changing his mind from what he said in Shulchan Aruch? Or is it just written more briefly without all the details because that's the nature of a Siddur, that's not a Shulchan Aruch? And secondly, if it is a difference, what's the basis? Why did the Alter Rebbe change his mind in this particular instance? And of course, we often have the Rebbe's interpretation on the Haggadah to turn to. And what I want to demonstrate in the next few minutes. Okay, so any questions or things that arise while on?
Bill wants to know what the bracha was for Israelis.
Yeah, we just lied. How does it differ?
At the end, it's instead of al pri hagafen, it's al pri gafno on its grapes. So let's see.
It's in the.
Let's see if it's in here. Let's see.
Oh.
In the art scroll.
No.
Okay, 1 second. Where are we? Yeah, if you look in the Art Scroll Siddur, this is the RCA edition of the Art Scroll Siddur, so the page numbers are probably a little bit different, but in this edition, it's on page 200. At the bottom, it says, if the fruit grew in Eretz Yisrael, substitute for periseha for haperis. It doesn't actually bring it for wine. I'm not sure why. It only says it brings it for fruit. But I'm not aware. I am not aware of an idea to say it for wine, for fruit, and not for wine. Anyway, okay. So I'm gonna read to you. We'll see on the time. Either one or two examples of how all this plays out in practice. So I'm going to read to you first of all a section or two of the Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch. After eating, just a moment, I want to see one thing here. One second. Here.
Look at that.
Boom, 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 boom. Okay. After you eat Afikoman, also this is from the Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch, Siman Tov Ayin Ches, that's chapter 478 at the very beginning, Sif Aleph number 1. After you eat Afikoman, it's forbidden to eat any food, chutz mimatzah shmura, except for matzah. I'm skipping a few words. So that the taste of the matzah shmura of the Afikoman should not leave your mouth. For the reason that is described in Siman Tov Ayin Zayin. So for some reason, he's saying we don't want the taste of the Afikoman to leave your mouth, and therefore don't eat anything else besides matzah. That means if you eat more matzah after the Afikoman, the matzah has the same taste as the Afikoman, so that's going to not going to take away the taste. But for some reason, we want you to keep the taste of Afikoman in your mouth. Why do we want you to keep the taste of Afikoman in your mouth? So, if you turn back to Siman Tov Ayin Zayin Sif Beis and Gimel, it says, One second. The fee, yeah, okay. What does it say here? Right. So it doesn't really. It's interesting. It doesn't really say the reason. In Taf and Zayin, it says that the reason you don't eat after the Afikoman is because the Afikoman corresponds to the Korban Pesach, and if it was the Korban Pesach, we want you to have the taste of the Korban Pesach in your mouth. But it's a strange phenomenon because we don't find with other mitzvahs that we want you to remain with the taste in your mouth. Why? Okay, fine. That's a good discussion. Not for right now. Maybe if we have time afterwards, I could get back to it. Okay, now. So it's forbidden to eat after the Afikoman because we want the taste of the matzah to stay in your mouth, but it is permissible to drink after the Afikoman any beverage that is not intoxicating. But intoxicating beverages you're not allowed to eat after the Afikoman. Why are you allowed to drink? Because even if you drink a lot of grape juice, you're not going, or orange juice, whatever it is, the taste of the drink isn't strong enough to remove the taste of a matzah from your mouth. You're still going to have some sort of remnant of matzah taste in your mouth even after you drink. Whereas if you eat a piece of meat, so then that's going to wash out the taste of the matzah.
You have 2 more cups.
Yeah, okay. Some disagree with this, and in those some we also include Bill, whose facial expression showed that he also disagreed with this, and they say no, that the taste of other drinks does counter the taste of the matzah. Except for water. Water you could drink after the Afikoman because water certainly does not take away the taste of the Afikoman. I'll take away the matzah, but other beverages, according to this second opinion, you have to be careful not to drink them. How do we rule? Okay, so we have here a machlokas. One, the first shitta is that after the Afikoman you're not allowed to eat, but you're allowed to drink anything that doesn't intoxicate. The second opinion is that you're not allowed to eat and you're not allowed to drink anything except for water. So which opinion do we follow? Says the Alter Rebbe, that if it's in absence of a great need, you should be careful according to the stricter opinion to avoid all drinks except for water, unless there's a strong need, you're really thirsty, whatever it is, so then you could have other drinks relying on the more lenient opinion. Okay? Now this, what I just read to you, like I said, is from Siman Tov Ein Ches Sif Aleph. In Siman Tov Pei Aleph, that's in it's 3 chapters later, in chapter 481, the Alter Rebbe again elaborates on this idea of not eating after Afikoman and not drinking intoxicating beverages, and according to another opinion, not drinking any beverages with the exception of water. And again, the same thing. It's with more detail, but it's the same thing. Okay. Now, pay close attention to this. Open up the Haggadah, which, like I said, Haggadah is part of the Alter Rebbe's Siddur. Yeah, same thing. That's what you meant. So, over there, it says like this. It comes to Afikoman.
What is the literal meaning of Haggadah?
It's connected to the word Magid, which is reciting the story of the Exodus. Says the Alter Rebbe Siddur. It says the Haggadah. Everyone listening carefully? And afterward, you take Afikoman, meaning after you've eaten your meal, take Afikoman. Give everybody in the family, everyone around the table, a kazayis, matzah of Afikoman. And you should be careful not to drink after the Afikoman. You should eat Afikoman reclining, and you should eat it before Chatzos. Now, you know what? I'm going to read that line one more time and translate every word. Pay close attention and tell me if you see anything that strikes to you as the Alter Rebbe is saying anything differently than he said in Shulchan Aruch. Again, afterwards you should take the Afikoman and give it out to all the members of the household, each person a kazayis, and be careful not to drink after the Afikoman, and eat it reclining, and you have to eat it before midnight, before chatzos. Does anybody notice anything different?
So do not drink anything.
Oh, says Bob that he's saying be careful not to drink. So what's different?
He's not even making exceptions.
What exception would you expect him to make?
That water, if you need something to drink, or the leniency of drinking something else, provided that there was nothing else and you really needed
Alcohol.
it.
I'm sorry, say that one more time?
Provided that you needed to drink, you could drink anything if you really needed it. in some
Okay,
capacity.
that's one difference that he doesn't say. Yes, what did you
No
do?
alcohol. You said you could have drinks that don't have alcohol.
Right, so what's he saying here? No, in the
Nothing.
Shulchan Aruch he said, Shulchan Aruch he brought two opinions. One opinion was that you only have to avoid alcoholic beverages. One is that you have to avoid all beverages besides for water. What's he saying here?
You can't drink anything.
Can't drink anything.
Be
Okay,
careful to avoid.
be careful to avoid, very good. Just one moment.
Well, it's not exactly a prohibition. That's,
Yeah, that's mincing words.
that's a very strong...
Just one moment.
That's giving permission, actually. Being careful, if I say, be careful to avoid, that's giving permission.
Okay. So there's a number of things to pull up over here. One is, why does he say be careful and not don't do it? Okay, that's a very important distinction. The Rebbe in his commentary on the Haggadah comments on that. We're not going to have time to go into that right now. But very valid point. Another point that Nasanel pointed out was that he doesn't say that if you're desperate, you can. And Shulchan Aruch said if you really need to, you can. He doesn't say that here. Now, when I read that, I don't see an omission. I see this is the difference between a Shulchan Aruch and a Siddur. In Shulchan Aruch, you're telling me all the details. And here, I'm telling you the gist. Be careful not to drink. If you're really hungry, go study Shulchan Aruch. Go ask your Rabbi, and he'll tell you, fine, it's okay. You could rely on this opinion.
Here's an immediate opinion,
Right.
here's the model.
I'll give you another difference. In Shulchan Aruch, it brings a discussion about how much you have to eat for the Afikoman. 1 kazayas or 2 kazayas. 1 olive's bulk or 2 olive's bulk. And in Shulchan Aruch, the Rebbe paskins l'chatchila that you should eat 2 olive bulks for the Afikoman. Right? Here it just says you should give everybody kazayas. Now, when I see that, so you might say, oh, the Rebbe is changing his mind. But that's not how we interpret it. The interpretation is, and as the Rebbe points out in his commentary to Haggadah, this is in fact the custom of the Beis Harav, of the Chabad Rabbeim, which in many cases spills over to become the general Chabad practice, especially here when it's explicit in Shulchan Aruch, that this is what you're supposed to do. That you eat 2 kazaysim. Why? Ideally you eat 2 kazaysim. Why does he here only say 1 kazayis? Again, we're not getting into all the nitty-gritty details of every detail of what you have to do. We're just sort of giving a generic guideline, and because it's certainly sufficient for the bare bones of the mitzvah to eat 1 kazayis for the Afikoman, so that's what the Alter Rebbe says over here. Okay. Now then, the Alter Rebbe says you should be careful not to drink. Now, if Eliyahu Rapoport was reading this line in the Haggadah, I would not read anything into it. Be careful not to drink. What shouldn't you drink? I'm not getting into the details. Learn Shulchan Aruch, you'll see that for sure you have to avoid alcoholic beverages. You're really supposed to avoid all beverages besides the water. Right? But the Rebbe doesn't do that. The Rebbe understands this to be a blanket statement. In other words, the Rebbe doesn't, for some reason, I don't know why, for some reason, in this sentence, the Alter Rebbe doesn't, even though the first half of the sentence where it says, give everybody a kazayas, the Rebbe says, he doesn't mean to preclude that you shouldn't eat 2 kazasim. He's not getting into that now. In the very next phrase of that same sentence where it says, be careful not to drink, the Rebbe comments, a number of things. Comments like you said, be careful, fine. And then he says, "Shelo yishtei," shouldn't drink midasosam dvarav, from his from his sort of omission or lack of qualification of his words. Mashma shemikol shtiya yizor afilu me'mayim. You should be careful, even not to drink water. Now, this is a tremendous chiddush of the Rebbe, because first of all, like I said, it's perfectly within reason to say that he just means don't avoid the drinks that you're not allowed to drink and go to Shulchan Aruch for details. So, and more specifically, there is no opinion in Shulchan Aruch that you shouldn't drink water after the Afikoman. He discusses it twice in Siman Tov Ayin Ches and in Siman Tov Pei Aleph. There is no mention of an opinion that you should avoid water after the Afikoman. So to read that into the Alter Rebbe's Siddur over here is a tremendous chiddush. It's a tremendous novelty. Now, what's the basis for all of this? Now, I mentioned to you before that Reb Chaim Noah writes that a big basis for many of the changes between the Siddur and the Shulchan Aruch is that in the Siddur the Alter Rebbe takes into account even a stringency of a lone opinion. So in Shulchan Aruch, what's happening over here is, and after the Rebbe brings this idea that you shouldn't even have water, he writes, be careful even water, and then he puts in parentheses a source. Rashmi avira b'mordchai soif perek arvi psachim. So in Shulchan Aruch, the Alter Rebbe brings all the primary opinions, which basically revolve around whether this prohibition is limited to eating and intoxicating beverages or extends even to other beverages. And the Alter Rebbe rules, okay, ideally you should be careful, if necessary you could be lenient, fine. There is this lone opinion, which is a chumrah that says even not to drink water. Who is the lone opinion? So the Rebbe here in the footnotes quotes Reb Shmuel Me'avira in the Mordechai, but if you trace it back, it comes back to what we were talking about at the very beginning of today's class, the poem from Rabbi Yosef Toiv Aleph, where he writes in the end of the poem, right the last line before Chazal so the Pesach, he writes, Kima lishtois mayim yechanes im chaylahu ayistanis, that if you're very thirsty, then you could be lenient to drink water. And the implication is that if you're not very thirsty, you should even avoid water. And this section of the poem is quoted by Tosfos and Psachim, and they deduce from here that Rabbi Yosef Toiv Elam holds differently than the vast majority of Poskim. All the Poskim hold that this prohibition of eating after the Afikoman does not extend to water, but Tosfos deduces from this line in the poem that Rabbi Yosef Toiv Elam holds it extends even to water. So what the Rebbe is doing over here is in line with Reb Chaim Noah. Reb Chaim Noah writes that the basis for the changes between the Siddur and the Shulchan Aruch is, for the most part, that in the Siddur the Alter Rebbe is telling us that we have to be careful even to fulfill the stringencies of lone opinions, which is not usually the normative way of paskening halacha. So that's what the Rebbe is doing over here. The Alter Rebbe writes, you might have had the impression to read it as just being don't drink, and then see the Shulchan Aruch for details, and you'll see the Shulchan Aruch for details, you'll see that it doesn't apply to water. But the Rebbe is saying no, the omission over here is specific. The Alter Rebbe wants us to be machmir, even for, like Reb Chaim Noah writes, that the Alter Rebbe wants us to be machmir, even for this lone opinion, that we should avoid even water after the Afikoman, as laid out by Rabbi Yosef Toiv Elam in the poem of Alikei Aruchis L'chal Basar. We'll finish over here. There are more examples and obviously more details to discuss, but I think here's a good place to stop.